The plane was filled with the usual sounds of travel. The low hum of engines, the soft chatter of passengers, the clinking of cups as flight attendants moved through the aisle. It felt like any other flight. People were reading magazines, children were giggling, and a few were already asleep. But then something happened that changed the entire atmosphere in seconds. A group of men suddenly stood up from their seats. Their voices were sharp, their movements quick. In their hands were objects no one wanted to see. The air inside the plane turned heavy. Fear spread faster than the sound of their shouts. Passengers froze, some gasped, others trembled. A mother held her child close, an elderly man lowered his head. It felt like the safety of the plane had vanished instantly. The pilot in the cockpit received the shocking message over the radio. The cabin crew looked pale, trying to hide their own fear as they followed orders. But in the middle of all this chaos, one woman sat quietly in her seat. She did not scream, she did not cry. She kept her eyes steady, her breath calm. People around her noticed her unusual stillness. In a moment where everyone else felt helpless, her calm presence stood out like a light in the darkness. The pilot, who had turned briefly to glance through the small window separating the cockpit from the cabin, saw her. While most passengers were overwhelmed, this one woman seemed different. She looked as if she was thinking, calculating, searching for something inside her mind. Her calmness was not born from ignorance. She knew exactly what was happening. She understood the danger was real. But she also understood that losing control would only make things worse. She reminded herself to breathe, to stay aware, and to look for a chance. The flight attendants whispered among themselves as they tried to calm the passengers. Some passengers prayed under their breath. Others shook so much they could hardly move. But the woman's quiet strength spread around her seat like an invisible shield. A young boy sitting a few rows away stopped crying after noticing her steady face. An elderly lady leaned closer to her, as if seeking comfort without a word. The terrorists barked orders, their voices hard. They wanted silence, they wanted control, and they wanted fear. They had achieved it with nearly everyone. But when their eyes passed over the calm woman, they saw no panic. For a brief moment, one of them frowned, confused. Why wasn't she trembling like the others? The pilot kept thinking about her. He had flown many flights, but in this moment nothing felt normal. Yet when he saw her stillness, it gave him a strange feeling of hope. He thought to himself, maybe she has a plan. Maybe she knows something we don't. Inside her own mind, the woman's thoughts were clear. She remembered stories of courage, of people who had faced danger and survived because they refused to let fear take over. She knew she had to stay awake, alert, and ready. She understood that her reaction could influence those around her. And even the outcome of the whole flight, minutes passed, but they felt like hours. Every sound in the cabin seemed louder. The clicking of buckles, the nervous breaths, the faint crying. The woman adjusted her seatbelt slowly, not to draw attention but to prepare herself. The pilot made coded announcements, trying to calm passengers while secretly signaling the ground team. Still, the woman remained the center of quiet strength. She glanced toward the aisle. She studied the movements of the men. She noticed details others missed, their body language, the way they spoke to each other, the moments they seemed distracted. Every small observation she tucked away in her mind. And slowly her calmness began to influence more people. The mother with the child whispered softly to her little one. The elderly man straightened a bit. The flight attendant who had been shaking found the courage to walk back down the aisle. It was as if her silence had planted seeds of courage in others. The pilot, watching again, felt a strange connection to her. He thought, in the middle of fear, she is like a lighthouse. He could not have guessed then that this same woman, who looked so calm, would soon make a move that no one expected, a move that would stun not only everyone on board but the entire world watching later. For now the cabin was a fragile balance of fear and silence. The woman waited, her eyes steady, her mind focused around her. The passengers clung to hope without realizing it came from her. The pilot braced himself for what was ahead, unaware that her next choice would shape the fate of every life on that flight. The air inside the plane stayed heavy. The passengers were trapped between fear and silence. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself was refusing to move forward. The men who had taken control kept walking up and down the aisle, their eyes sharp, their movements quick. The calm woman still sat in her seat, but her mind was moving faster than ever. She was not simply sitting there without thought. She was observing, learning, and waiting. Her stillness was her strength. She knew fear could blur judgment, But calmness could open doors. The pilot inside the cockpit spoke in low whispers to his co-pilot. His voice was steady, but his eyes revealed the storm inside him. He thought again of the woman. The way she had not broken down like the others, he couldn't explain it. But he felt that somehow she was important in this story. Meanwhile, the passengers whispered quietly. Some wondered who the woman was. Some looked at her with silent questions in their eyes, as if asking her to guide them without words. She gave them no dramatic signals, no sudden gestures. She simply sat upright, breathing evenly, showing with her presence that fear did not have to win. The men who had taken control began arguing among themselves in their own language. Their voices grew sharper. One of them gestured toward the cockpit, another toward the passengers. The woman noticed the tension. She studied their faces, the way their eyes darted, the way their hands moved. She realized they were not as united as they wanted everyone to believe. A flight attendant walked past her row, her hands shaking as she tried to offer water to a passenger. The woman gave her a small nod, just a little gesture of reassurance. The attendant's shoulders eased slightly. It was like a hidden language of courage passing between them. The child in the back began to cry again. His mother tried to hush him, but the sound filled the cabin. One of the men shouted, his anger spilling out. The woman turned her head just enough to look toward the child. Her calm gaze reached the mother. The mother pressed the child against her chest and whispered soothingly. Slowly, the crying softened. The angry man looked back once, then moved on. But the woman had noticed he was nervous, not fully in control. The pilot made another coded announcement, speaking as if everything was fine, but slipping in words that the ground team would understand. He kept glancing at the woman when he could. It was almost as if he drew his own courage from her. Inside her thoughts, the woman began forming a plan. She knew she couldn't fight them with force, but maybe she could use their cracks against them. She had to wait for the right moment. She reminded herself that panic was the enemy of clear action. Passengers began to whisper less. They started to watch the woman more. Her calmness had grown into something larger. It was no longer just her own strength. It was becoming a quiet signal to everyone that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this together. The terrorists noticed her again. One of them stopped near her row, staring at her. He expected fear, but her eyes did not shift, her hands did not shake. For a moment he seemed unsettled. He muttered something under his breath and walked on. She had made him doubt himself, even if only for a second. The elderly man across the aisle leaned closer and whispered, "How are you so calm?" She gave him a soft glance and whispered back, "Because fear won't save us." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The man leaned back, his breathing steadier. The plane moved through the clouds, its engine steady, but inside lives were hanging in balance. Every second mattered, the woman knew this. She was waiting for the smallest mistake from the men, the moment where their anger or their arguments would open a door for her to act. The pilot's hands tightened on the controls. He kept telling himself that he had to stay ready, but a thought stayed in his mind. He thought of her not as a passenger anymore, but as a key. Something about her presence told him that when the time came, she would do something no one expected. The silence in the cabin returned. Heavy but fragile, the men watched. The passengers prayed, the crew tried to stay strong. And in the middle of it all, the calm woman breathed deeply, waiting, preparing, carrying inside her the quiet courage that would soon change everything. The hours inside the plane stretched on like an endless tunnel. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, barely moving, afraid of drawing attention. The sound of the engines felt louder than usual. Yet it was the silence of fear that truly filled the cabin. The calm woman still held her quiet strength. She had not spoken much, yet her presence had become a silent anchor for those around her. People found themselves glancing at her again and again, as if checking to see if courage was still possible. And every time her steady face reminded them to breathe. The men who controlled the plane were restless. Their voices grew sharper, their arguments louder. One pointed toward the cockpit with frustration. Another slapped the seat of a passenger who had shifted slightly. Their control looked strong on the surface, but cracks were beginning to show. The woman noticed everything. She noticed the way one of them kept checking his watch, as if time mattered more to him than anything else. She noticed how another's hands shook when he raised his voice. And she noticed the smallest details, their patterns, their blind spots, their unease. The pilot and co-pilot sat tensely in the cockpit, their eyes flicking between the controls and the small monitor that showed glimpses of the cabin. The pilot whispered, She hasn't moved much, but it feels like she's watching everything. The co-pilot nodded. It feels like she knows more than the rest of us. Neither of them knew who she was, but both believed her stillness meant something. The flight attendants moved carefully, trying to serve water to keep passengers from fainting. Their fear was still visible, but their steps were steadier now. Some of that steadiness came from the woman. She had become an example without speaking more than a few words. A child a few rows back leaned toward his mother and whispered, "She's not scared." The mother smiled weakly and whispered back, "Then we don't have to be either." Even in whispers, her influence was spreading, but the danger was still real. The men shouted again, ordering silence. One slammed his hand against the overhead compartment. The sound made several passengers flinch. The calm woman did not move. Her eyes only followed him, steady and unshaken. That moment unsettled him. He stopped for a second, then turned away quickly. He did not want to admit it, but her calmness made him feel weak. He wondered why she wasn't afraid when everyone else was. Inside her mind, the woman began shaping a clearer plan. She could not rise suddenly and risk everyone's safety, but she could prepare. She could wait for the moment when their arguments grew into distraction. She could use their cracks against them. She could act when they least expected it. She tested her seatbelt quietly, making sure it was loose enough for her to move if she needed to. She slid her shoes slightly against the floor, measuring how fast she could stand. She looked toward the aisle, memorizing the distance. She was preparing in ways no one else could see. The elderly man across the aisle whispered again, "Do you think we'll survive this?" She looked at him, her voice low but firm. "If we don't lose our courage, yes." He swallowed hard and nodded. Her words gave him something to hold on to. The plane continued through the clouds, its wings steady, but inside, tension twisted tighter with every passing minute. The men's voices rose again, arguing in quick bursts. Their attention slipped more each time they fought with one another. The woman's eyes sharpened. She knew the moment she had been waiting for was getting closer. The pilot inside the cockpit felt the same. He kept thinking, "Something will happen soon. I can feel it." He did not know if it would come from the men or from the quiet woman who never broke, but he was certain the flight would not stay trapped in this silence forever. The passengers sat in their seats like statues, but behind their stillness were hearts pounding fast. Some whispered silent prayers, others clenched their fists, and yet, when they looked toward the calm woman, they found a fragile thread of courage. She was no longer just a passenger. She had become a symbol in that cabin, a reminder that even in the face of danger, fear did not have to own them, and soon, with the right chance, she would take a step that no one could forget. A step that would change not only the people inside that plane, but the world outside waiting to hear their story. The tension in the cabin had turned into something heavy. Like a storm waiting to break, the men controlling the plane were growing restless. Their footsteps sounded harsher. Their voices carried more anger. It was clear their confidence was fading. Though they tried to hide it, the passengers sensed it too. They clung tighter to their seats, hoping not to draw attention. But the energy inside the plane was shifting. Fear was still strong, but something else had begun to grow. An invisible thread of courage spreading among them. At the center of it all, the calm woman stayed steady. Her eyes moved quietly, watching every detail. She could sense their weakness more clearly now. She knew their control was not as solid as they wanted people to believe. Every shout, every sudden order revealed cracks in their unity. One of the men slammed the back of a seat, shouting for silence even though no one was speaking. The sound made a baby cry. His mother pressed him to her chest, rocking him quickly. The man raised his hand again as if to strike the seat, but the woman's gaze fell directly on him. She did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. Her calm stare froze him in place. For a brief second, he hesitated. His hand dropped, and he walked away. No words had been spoken, but something had passed between them. Something that made him unsure of himself. The passengers around her exchanged silent glances. They knew her calmness had just protected them. The pilot in the cockpit kept glancing at the monitor. He whispered to the co-pilot, "She's doing something." Even without moving, the co-pilot nodded. "It's strange, but it feels like she's changing the entire cabin." The pilot gripped the controls, uncertain of what would come next, but certain that she was part of it. The men argued again, their voices rose, their movements sharper. They barked orders at the attendants, who scrambled to obey. But the woman watched closely. She noticed one man kept checking the aisle behind him, as if he was afraid of losing control there. She noticed another look toward the cockpit more than the passengers. Their minds were not in one place. The elderly man across from her leaned forward, whispering, "Why are they fighting each other?" She answered softly. "Because they are afraid too." Her words gave him a strange sense of comfort. If the men who held the power were afraid, then maybe the passengers still had hope. The child a few rows behind whispered to his mother again. "She's not scared," his mother nodded. "She's waiting for something." And the truth was, she was inside her thoughts. The woman counted time. She measured their steps, their patterns, the way they rotated down the aisle. She pictured what might happen if she moved at the right moment. She thought about the passengers around her, about the lives depending on her calmness. And she reminded herself that courage did not always mean force. It could mean timing. It could mean action born from clarity. The pilot's coded messages continued, slipping through radio waves to the ground team waiting below. Help was preparing, but inside the plane, time was still their greatest enemy. Every second felt like it could break either into safety or disaster. The woman adjusted her seatbelt slightly again. Her movements were so small that no one but the person beside her noticed. The passenger next to her looked confused. She whispered, "Be ready." The words sank deep, even though they did not know what she meant. The men shouted again, louder this time. Their argument was now clear to everyone. They were not agreeing on what to do next. Their voices cracked, their gestures wild, and in that chaos, the woman's eyes sharpened. She knew this was the first real opening. The passengers held their breath as the shouting grew. Some closed their eyes, expecting the worst. Others leaned forward slightly, watching the calm woman as if waiting for her signal. They didn't even realize they were doing it, but she had become their unspoken guide. The pilot whispered again, "It's coming." He didn't know how, but he could feel it. The co-pilot tightened his jaw. She's about to move. The cabin was filled with fear, but within it was something else, a fragile but powerful spark, lit by one woman who refused to lose her calm. And as the men argued louder, as their control slipped more, she prepared herself for the moment that would change everything. The cabin air felt heavier than before. Each breath from the passengers was shallow, as if everyone was afraid of making too much sound. The men continued pacing, their voices sharp, their anger spilling out. They had been in control for hours, but now the cracks in their strength were too clear to miss. The calm woman sat with her hands resting gently on her lap. Her stillness looked the same as before, but inside she was no longer waiting. She had been patient, watching, learning, but now her focus shifted. The moment was coming, the one she had prepared herself for. The men shouted again. One slammed his hand against the seat in frustration. Another pushed a flight attendant forward. Their argument had grown into chaos. They barked orders at each other, forgetting for a few seconds about the passengers. The woman's eyes followed every movement. She saw how one of them turned his back longer than usual. She saw how another looked toward the cockpit in anger instead of the cabin. She whispered to herself, "This is it." Her heart was steady, her breath calm, but her mind was sharper than ever. The elderly man across from her saw her shift slightly in her seat. He whispered, "What are you doing?" She looked at him, her voice low, "Trust me." His eyes widened, but something in her tone made him nod. Slowly, carefully, she leaned forward. Her movement was small, almost invisible to the men distracted by their fight. She picked up the small metal spoon left on her tray from earlier. It was a simple object, but in her hand, it became something more. She slipped it into her sleeve. Hiding it from sight, her calm face never changed. Not even when one of the men turned sharply. His eyes scanned the rows, demanding obedience. But when they passed over her, he found no fear, only the same quiet strength. He frowned, muttered something under his breath, and turned away. She had fooled him again. The passengers around her felt their hearts pounding harder. Some noticed her subtle movement, some didn't, but everyone could feel that something was shifting. For the first time, fear was not the only energy in the cabin. There was also expectation. The pilot in the cockpit leaned forward toward the small monitor. He whispered, "She's preparing." The co-pilot asked, "How can you tell?" The pilot's voice dropped. "Because she hasn't blinked once in the last few minutes." He didn't know what she planned, but he knew she was ready. The woman's mind worked quickly. She knew she could not face all of them at once. That would be foolish. But she also knew that if she struck at the right moment, if she created enough distraction, others would have the chance to move. Her calmness had given them courage, and now her action might give them opportunity. The men shouted louder. Their argument was now about what to do next. One wanted to change the course, another refused. Their words clashed like knives. Their control over the cabin slipped further with every second. The woman whispered to herself, "Not yet. Wait." She tightened her fingers around the spoon hidden in her sleeve. Her pulse beat steady, not fast. She had trained her mind to stay clear. Her chance would come not when she forced it, but when their weakness opened the door. The passengers were glued to their seats, but their eyes turned again and again toward her. Even without knowing it, they were waiting for her. She had become their symbol, their secret hope. A flight attendant passed near her row, her face pale, her steps shaky. The woman gave her a soft nod. The attendant's breath caught, but she straightened her back. It was a tiny moment, but enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Then it happened. One of the men shoved another in anger. Their voices rose, their eyes locked on each other. Their backs turned to the cabin for just a few seconds. The woman's eyes flashed, she whispered inside her mind. Now her hand moved quiet but fast. The spoon slid from her sleeve into her grip. Her body leaned forward, ready. It wasn't the act of a reckless person. It was the act of someone who had waited with patience, studied with precision, and chosen her moment with care. The passengers closest to her felt it. They didn't know what she was about to do, but they knew the storm was finally breaking. The elderly man beside her gripped his armrest, whispering a prayer. The child in the back stopped crying. As if sensing the shift, the pilot in the cockpit tightened his grip on the controls. His voice dropped into a whisper. "It's starting." The co-pilot's eyes widened. "What is?" The pilot shook his head slowly. "Her move." And in that fragile space between fear and courage, between silence and action, the calm woman prepared to strike the first blow that no one saw coming. The move that would begin to change the fate of everyone on board. The cabin was at its breaking point. The arguments of the men had grown into shouts, their control slipping faster than they realized. Passengers sat frozen, their eyes darting between the loud voices in the aisle and the calm woman who had not broken even once. Everyone could feel it, the air was about to change. The woman's hand tightened around the spoon hidden in her sleeve. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a harmless piece of metal. But to her, it was a tool, not for chaos, but for a precise strike at the right time. She had studied every movement, every flaw, and now the moment she had waited for was here. Two of the men shoved each other, their anger exploding. Their backs turned briefly toward the passengers, their focus locked on their own argument. In those few seconds, the woman rose. Her movement was sudden but controlled. She slipped into the aisle, her steps soundless. Passengers gasped quietly, afraid the men would notice, but their shouts covered the noise. The woman moved closer, her eyes sharp. She did not rush. She aimed with patience. Her target was not just any of them. It was the one whose hand often lingered near a weapon, the one who seemed most dangerous. With one swift motion, she struck. The spoon jabbed hard into his wrist, sharp enough to make him cry out in shock. The weapon clattered to the floor, sliding under a seat. The sound of metal hitting the cabin floor made every passenger's heart jump. The man screamed, clutching his wrist. The others spun around, their faces twisted in confusion. For the first time, they were caught off guard. They had expected fear, not resistance, and certainly not from a woman who had sat so silently all this time. The passengers closest to her froze, their mouths open. But then something remarkable happened. The elderly man across the aisle shoved his armrest upward, knocking it into one of the men's knees. The young boy's mother pulled her child under her seat, clearing the path for others. It was as if the woman's courage had ignited something in everyone around her. The injured man shouted, pointing at her. His voice shook with more than just pain. It carried disbelief. The calm woman stood tall, her breathing steady. Her voice, firm but not loud, broke the silence. "You will not control us." The words rang across the cabin like a spark in the darkness. For the first time, the balance had shifted. It was no longer only fear controlling the passengers, it was also courage. The pilot in the cockpit heard the noise through the monitor. His eyes widened, he whispered, "She did it." The co-pilot leaned forward. "What do we do?" The pilot's voice shook. "We wait for the right chance. She's creating it for us." The men scrambled, their control breaking apart. One lunged toward the woman, but two passengers stood. Blocking his path, their legs shook, but they didn't back away. Another passenger shouted, "Enough." His voice cracked, but it was louder than it had been in hours. The calm woman's eyes never wavered. She shifted slightly, keeping her stance strong. She didn't need to attack wildly. She only needed to remind them that fear was no longer their weapon. She had stripped it away. The passengers began to stir. Some stood, some shouted, some simply raised their heads for the first time since the takeover. The cabin no longer looked like a cage of silent victims. It looked like a crowd beginning to awaken. The men barked orders, desperate to regain control, but their voices did not land the same way. The woman's action had broken the spell. Their shouts now sounded like noise, not commands. One of the men rushed to grab the fallen weapon under the seat, but a passenger kicked it farther down the aisle. Another shoved his tray table into the path. The courage was spreading faster now. It was unstoppable. The calm woman stood in the middle of it all, breathing evenly, her hand still tight around the spoon. But her true weapon was no longer in her grip. It was in the courage she had awakened. Her stillness had planted the seed, and her strike had lit the fire. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls, whispering, "Hold on. Just a little longer." He knew ground support was coming. But the woman had bought them something priceless: time and hope. The cabin shook slightly as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Passengers gasped, the men stumbled. The woman used the moment. Pushing one of them back with her shoulder, the passengers closest to her shouted again. Louder this time, their voices rose not in fear, but in defiance. The men looked at each other, their eyes filled with something they had not felt since stepping onto the plane: doubt. And in that doubt, the passengers saw their chance. The woman steadied herself once more, calm as ever. She whispered to the elderly man near her, "Stay strong, it's not over yet." He nodded, his hands trembling but his eyes determined. The cabin was no longer the same. Fear was still there, but it no longer ruled. The passengers had begun to believe. The men had begun to falter, and at the center of it all, one calm woman stood ready to carry them into the final fight for survival. The cabin had transformed. Moments earlier it was filled with silence and fear, but now it was alive with courage. The calm woman stood in the aisle, her shoulders firm, her eyes steady. She had struck the first blow, and it had awakened something powerful in everyone. The men who once looked unstoppable now looked unsettled. Their voices were still loud, but their words no longer carried the same weight. Their shouts echoed against passengers who no longer cowered as before. Their control was slipping, and they knew it. The injured man clutched his wrist, glaring at the woman. He wanted to lunge at her again, but he hesitated. Something about her eyes made him pause. It was as if she could see straight through his anger, straight into the fear he was hiding. Passengers shifted in their seats, some rose slowly, their hands gripping armrests for balance. Some whispered to each other. Their movements were small, but they were no longer frozen. The calm woman had changed the rules. Fear had lost its grip. The pilot in the cockpit leaned close to the monitor. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's happening." The co-pilot's heart pounded. "Do we take action?" The pilot shook his head. "Not yet, she's leading them." "Wait." One of the men pointed toward the passengers, his voice cracking as he barked an order. "Sit down, all of you. Now." But his command met silence. No one moved. No one obeyed. Instead, eyes turned toward the calm woman, waiting for her signal. She did not speak loudly. She didn't need to. Her calm voice reached the ears of those near her, and they passed it on. "Stay together." The words rippled across the cabin like an invisible wave. The elderly man who once trembled now stood beside her. His legs shook, but his voice did not. "We're not afraid anymore," he said. His words were simple, but they broke something inside the men. The power of silence was gone, replaced by voices rising against them. The men panicked, they shouted louder, they pointed, they threatened, but the passengers were no longer the same. A young man near the back shoved his tray table hard into the aisle. Blocking the path, a mother pulled her child behind her and stood tall. A group of passengers began to rise together. The calm woman's hand tightened around the spoon, but she no longer needed to use it. Her true strength was already at work. She had united the cabin. She had given them back their courage. The plane jolted again from turbulence. The men stumbled. One fell against a seat. Another tried to grab a bag for balance. In that brief moment, passengers surged, they pushed forward, they grabbed arms, they pulled the men away from the aisle. Their voices rose louder. No more! The cockpit shook as the pilot gripped the controls. He heard the struggle behind him. His chest tightened. But his heart filled with hope, he whispered. They're fighting back. The co-pilot nodded, eyes wet. They're not alone anymore. The calm woman pushed one of the men aside, using the same quiet strength she had carried since the beginning. He fell back. Tangled between seats, passengers piled on, holding him down. Another tried to rush forward, but the elderly man blocked him, surprising even himself with the strength he found. The cabin filled with noise, not of fear, but of resistance. It was no longer the sound of helplessness, it was the sound of survival. The passengers had taken their courage back, and there was no turning it around. The men shouted, their voices desperate now. But their power was broken, they were outnumbered. Outmatched by people who had decided they would not be victims anymore. And at the heart of it all was the woman, calm even as the chaos erupted, guiding them without needing to shout. Minutes later, the cabin grew still again. The passengers stood together, breathing hard but victorious. The men who once controlled them were restrained. Their threats silenced, the plane was theirs again. The calm woman finally sat back down, her breathing steady, her eyes closed for a brief moment. She had done what she needed to do around her. People whispered words of thanks, some cried in relief, some touched her shoulder gently. They all knew she had been the spark that saved them. The pilot's voice came over the speakers, his tone firm but filled with emotion. We are safe. The cabin erupted in quiet cheers and tears. People hugged each other, gripping hands, holding children close. They had faced fear together and they had won. And as the plane continued toward its destination, one truth became clear to everyone on board. They would never forget the day they saw a woman stay calm while danger surrounded them. They would never forget how her stillness turned into action, how her courage turned into hope, and how her hope turned into survival. Her next move had indeed stunned the world. Not because it was loud, not because it was reckless, but because it showed the quiet, unstoppable power of courage.